what did you find in regards to the overhead derivatives as it pertains to performance? Why are those relevant?
Well, I could say in this matter, I wouldn't say that these exercises are magic or they have some magical properties that you should use. I just say that these are important tools. And as a coach, if you are training to a general sporting population, not just weightlifters, if you are training to maybe rugby players or don't know, like volleyball players, something like that, they can be very important tools, right, to implement in your training, especially because you are targeting all the lower body tribal extension, the propulsion phase, like the power development, strength, and also it requires a lot of motor learning, stability, coordination, because you have to transfer the force from the lower body to the upper body in one continuous motion for the push press. Then for the push gear and split gear, you have to catch underneath. So I think it requires a lot of coordination, which might be very interesting for a sport population.
And yeah, that I'm glad you actually named the lifts, because I didn't do that. If we're defining these overhead derivatives as specifically the push press and the jerk derivative, so we could probably lump in, yeah, push jerk, power jerk, split jerk. It all has that dip and drive phase, at least, right? There's some distinctions here between terms, and I'd like you, if you can, to delineate and define certain terms that people will see in the literature regarding force production and regarding power output. Can you make a distinction between force, just peak force, and rate of force development? We'll start there. The differences between force and rate of force development.
Well, if you allow me, I'm going to start defining first the impulse, which is force by time. And also, if you want to increase your performance, all right, you can do either by increasing the force in a given amount of time or by increasing the time that you are applying force. Once you know that, right, which is important is that in many sports, the time that you have to apply force is constrained. Then it is not useful, right, to apply force for a more time because you don't have that time. What you need actually is to apply more force in less time. That's why the rate of force development comes to this point, right? Because this is the rate of force by the unit of time. So you should try to increase the amount of force for a given time. For example, 100 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds, depending on the sport and depending on the sporting task that you want to test. The peak force is the highest value that you find, but it doesn't mean that the peak force is more important than the rate of force development. I would say that the rate of force development for many sports is more important than the peak force. Maybe for a power lift, doing a deadlift, maybe the peak force is more related to performance because you have to lift greater amounts of load and you have more time. But if we are talking about the jumping or something like that, probably the rate of force development is more related to sport performance than the peak force.
And that's interesting. And I've seen the 250 milliseconds as kind of like, in general, a lot of sporting actions, the force that you need to generate is in that 250 millisecond range. And if by the time you get to a peak force output, whatever that sporting action is already done. You don't even really get there. So it's like, to your point, how fast can you generate? Now, you want to generate as much force in that small time as possible, but you made a distinction there between the impulse. And it's not necessarily that a greater impulse, which is the time, it's kind of the area under the curve of the force time curve, the impulse. Would you say it's not necessarily beneficial to have a longer impulse or a greater impulse? And we're talking like a jerk or a push press maybe specifically here.
What I've seen now, because now we are studying it hopefully it will be published in a few time. Now we are studying like the kinetics and kinematic differences, also the effect of load. And what we've seen is that there are two different kinds of lifters, or at least the lifter that we are testing. The ones who applied, like let's say, who applies more force in less time, and the ones who take like longer time to apply force. So they have difference in impulse. Maybe let's say the split jerk or the push jerk is successful for both kind of lifters, but they have different strategy. It's like for the counter movement jump, you can have a different strategy. Even the fatigue might impact the strategy that you are going to use, and you can get the same performance. So when we talk about performance for a jump, it's the centimeters. When we talk about performance for a jerk, is that you complete or not the lift. So you can get the same performance. It means get the lift successfully, independently of your strategy. That's why we use impulse, right? Just to see the different strategy in the lifters, and it provides us with many valuable information.
So your point is, it's not necessarily that you want a shorter impulse and more force, or a longer impulse and more force. You're using these metrics as simply information, and you're using them to identify different types of lifters. So in the gym, this would manifest. An athlete who uses a longer impulse would maybe have a deeper dip in their jerk dip, or perhaps a longer pause, the amortization phase. Yeah, I always mess that up. Always. So maybe a deeper dip, longer amortization phase, versus somebody who you would perceive as being elastic, quote unquote, a shorter dip and kind of that boom pop and the bars up. Same outcome. One is utilizing elastic properties, higher rate of force development, shorter impulse. The other one, longer impulse. And to your point is, one's not necessarily better than the other. We can use these things to just identify the lifter.
Yeah, you define it perfectly, right? At that point, especially what we have seen also, and you can find some information about that, because this is also specific depending on the structural anatomy. Let's say taller athletes, they are able to perform deeper dips, right? They are able to apply, or let's say, to have more longer time to apply force, and they get higher relative velocities in comparison to shorter athletes. This is because just the mechanical levers. So I think depending on many factors, the lifters, they can have different strategies, and no one strategy is better than the other. It depends. At the end, it depends on you, and it's the weightlifting coach, the one who has to have the knowledge to differentiate that and to provide their athletes with the best strategy that they can adopt. That's my point of view.